Now it's time to start the webinar. I'll count down from 3 and hit start webinar, which will allow attendees to enter the session. Then I'll begin speaking as soon as after about 20 seconds after we launch the webinar. Just give it a few more seconds here for folks to be able to join the panel today. Thanks everyone for joining. We're just giving it a few more seconds for folks to filter into the webinar. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Place-Based Risks for Violence and Community Level Prevention mini symposium. I'm Lainey, and I am standing in for Dr. Mark Zimmerman temporarily, whose internet inconveniently crashed right before the session. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to help present today's session. Place-based prevention is a really exciting area with so many possibilities for community level prevention of firearms. There's opportunities for more scalable prevention, potentially more cost-effective prevention at the community level that does not rely on individual behavior change, which we know is costly and often ineffective. So really excited to hear more from folks informing place-based risks for firearm violence prevention and sharing some community level strategies to help reduce the risks for firearm violence in communities. So thank you all for being here. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and only the presenters and moderator are visible. Chat is disabled, so please go ahead and use the Q&A feature for all your questions. And a live transcript is available. And if you prefer to hide the captions, please click the up arrow next to the transcript button and select hide transcript. All right, so at this time, please join me in welcoming our presenters. Dr. Lauren McGee is an assistant professor at the School of Public Health and Environmental Affairs at Purdue University. Her presentation will explore the victim, incident, and community characteristics related to non-fatal shooting assault injuries. Stephen Oliphant is a doctoral student at the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. He will discuss how community features such as alcohol outlets may serve as firearm violence attractors and explore implications for place-based prevention. Next up, we have Dr. Daniel Semenza. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminal Justice at Rutgers University, and he'll present a street network analysis examining the spatial relationships between firearm dealers and shooting incidents. Finally, Dr. Jonathan Jay, an assistant professor at Boston University School of Public Health, will examine how neighborhood characteristics may influence the effect of demolition on firearm violence. Yeah, and just as a reminder, again, we'll have Q&A at the end, so go ahead and use the Q&A feature throughout the presentations today to send in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can as time allows. So at this point, I'd like to begin screen sharing with Dr. Lauren McGee's slides. And you can get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Lainey. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren McGee, and I'm assistant professor in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IUPUI in Indianapolis, and I'm very excited to be here today to discuss pediatric non-fatal shootings. Next slide, please. I'd first like to acknowledge my collaborators and mentors on this project and most of my projects, Drs. Weehee, Alsma, and Fortenberry, as well as my ongoing partnership with the Indianapolis Police Department. This project is also supported as part of my KL2 award. Next slide, please. As most of you already know, intentional assault-related non-fatal shootings are 3 to 4 times more prevalent than fatal injuries. However, we typically hear more about fatal injuries, largely due to the severity, but also due to the prior lack of data and research on non-fatal shootings at both the local and national levels. Fortunately, more data on non-fatal shootings is becoming available, and recent research demonstrates that pediatric non-fatal shootings have increased in recent years, most notably during the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, we know that firearm violence spatially concentrates within structurally disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that exposure to such firearm violence, both direct as a victim and indirect as just a witness or a resident, contributes to adverse health outcomes at higher rates of mental health and disability. However, we know very little about pediatric non-fatal shooting assaults, where they're occurring, and the circumstances surrounding these injuries. Next slide, please. Therefore, this descriptive study is the beginning of a larger project to better understand the victim, incident, and neighborhood characteristics of pediatric non-fatal shooting injuries. Next slide. So the current study is a retrospective descriptive cohort study that takes place in Indianapolis, Indiana. The study time period is from January of 2018 through June 30th of 2021. We combine multiple data sources from the Indianapolis Police Department, the City of Indianapolis, and the US Census. We used IMPD data on non-fatal shootings, as well as detective investigative notes and incident narratives, and police 911 calls for service on child-related calls and shots fired. The inclusion criteria was the injury had to be all assault-related non-fatal shootings, and the victims were under the age of 18. There were 134 victims during this time period, and we specifically even looked further down at victims under the age of 16, and there were 55. Next slide, please. The study procedures, victim age, race, sex, incident location were all included in police records. We did categorize age into groups of 0 to 10 years, 11 to 15 years of age, and 16 and 17-year-olds, as this represents developmental phases into the involvement of gun violence. We then coded detective notes and narratives of the incident for the motive or the reason behind the shooting. Myself and another coder determined 4 different categories: stray bullet, drive-by, argument or fight, and robbery. And then the difference between a stray bullet and drive-by is if the victim was inside their residence or outside at the time of the shooting. We also coded the number of victims, the injury location on the body as extremities, arms and legs, head, or body mass. We geocoded the point level data and aggregated counts of pediatric non-fatal shootings in groups of 1 non-fatal shooting, 2 non-fatal shootings, or 3 or more to the census tract to examine neighborhood characteristics, and then used a one-way ANOVA to examine differences across these groups. Next slide, please. Our results indicate that the rate of pediatric non-fatal shootings has increased over the last 3 years from a rate of 11.3 to a rate of 20.2 per 100,000 in 2020. Although the pediatric non-fatal shootings have increased, the proportion to the total number of non-fatal shootings has actually remained the same. So pediatric non-fatal shootings typically contribute between 6 and 8% of the total number of non-fatal shootings, and this has remained consistent even despite this increase. What has increased, though, is the number of victims under the age of 10, and these trends have continued into 2021. As for victim demographics, 86% are Black, 81% are male, nearly 60% are ages 16 or 17, and 40% are under the age of 16. Next slide, please. When we look at the incident circumstances, the chart, you can look across the motive or the reason behind the shooting in the age group, and you can see the developmental trajectories into firearm violence. Nearly all victims under the age of 10 were struck by a bullet coming through their residence walls. There were some stray bullet or drive-by victims between the ages of 11 and 15, but this is where robbery and arguments being the motive behind the shooting becomes more prevalent. Then when you look at 16 and 17-year-olds, the motives or the reasons are mostly unknown. This is typically contributed to an unwillingness to talk to the police, largely due to the code of the street or mistrust, which Dr. Bronson nicely discussed the complexities of this morning. When we looked at the incidence of victims under the age of 16, 28% had 2 to 3 victims, and 8% actually met the definition of a mass shooting of being 4 or more victims. And as for injury location, the majority of the victims had minor injuries and were hit in an extremity, so an arm, leg, foot, or ankle. Additionally, 70% of these victims went to our pediatric trauma hospital in Indianapolis. Next slide, please. If we look at the spatial patterns by census tracts, 18% of census tracts experienced 1 shooting, 8% experienced 2 shootings, and nearly 7% experienced 3 or more pediatric shootings, with the highest census tract experiencing 8 pediatric non-fatal shootings during the study timeframe. If you look at the poverty rate, percent of female-headed households, and percent of Black residents, census tracts with 3 or more pediatric non-fatal shootings, they are slightly worse, but overall, all census tracts that have 1 pediatric shootings are fairly similar. Now, if you look at the 911 calls for any child welfare or child abuse, child assault, and 911 calls for shots fired, census tracts with 2 or more pediatric non-fatal shootings have much higher rates of these calls. These communities also have slightly more abandoned homes, higher rates of residents calling 311 for city services, and these types of calls are commonly more indicators of community distress and beyond just what we typically think of structural disadvantage. Next slide, please. So their key findings from this study are: 1, that pediatric non-fatal shootings are increasing, but they're increasing at the same proportion as overall non-fatal shootings. 2nd, that stray bullets into residents and drive-bys are the most common circumstance for victims under the age of 16 to be shot, and that all neighborhoods with high firearm violence and pediatric non-fatal shootings have high structural disadvantage, but higher levels of neighborhood distress, more gunfire, calls for child welfare checks, child abuse contributes to more pediatric non-fatal shootings. I know I'm done with time, but future directions will be to combine these police records with electronic health records to better understand the individual as well as the community trauma associated with these pediatric non-fatal shootings. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Oliphant, and I'm a doctoral student at the Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice. Today I'll be speaking about spatial attraction between shootings and various locations in the city of Detroit. Next slide, please. I want to start by briefly mentioning studies that motivated this analysis. On the left, you'll see findings from recent place-based evaluations in Flint, Philadelphia, and Detroit. The main takeaway here being that place-based initiatives can achieve reductions in firearm violence. On the right are characteristics of microplaces that have been associated with shootings. Microplaces generally refers to smaller geographic areas of measurement ranging from a specific location to an entire street segment. So in this presentation, I focus on the area immediately surrounding a location up to several hundred feet. Despite recent evaluations of place-based interventions and studies that examine crime and violence at the microplace level, there's still a need to identify locations that are attractors of firearm violence. Next slide, please. So there are two studies in particular that motivated this analysis, both of which were conducted in the Northeast US and analyzed data collected in 2012 or 2015. In Boston, but not Newark, schools were identified as significant attractors of shootings. And in Newark, New Jersey, shooting attractors included liquor and grocery stores, bus stops, and home foreclosures. So I sought to examine the spatial relationship between shootings and similar locations in Detroit using the cross-K method, while also disaggregating shootings by the time of day to determine whether the relationships were time variant or invariant. Next slide. The data for fatal and non-fatal shootings in Detroit were obtained from the Detroit Police Department and are restricted to shootings that occurred outside a residence in 2020. So about a third occurred during the day and 2/3 at night. There were over 1,000 unique shooting incidents and approximately 7.5 shootings per square mile of land in Detroit. Apart from alcohol outlet data, which came from the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, all other data are from Detroit's open data portal. So alcohol outlets were included as a single type of location in the analysis and also differentiated based on if they were strictly on premises or off premises sites. Green light locations are retail businesses and residential locations that participate in Detroit's Project Greenlight, which is a crime reduction initiative. And registered vacant properties are buildings or structures that were registered with the city as being vacant in the year 2019 or 2020. Blighted vacant properties are buildings or structures which were cited for failing to maintain a vacant structure in those years, and those are restricted to just properties where the citation was upheld and not dismissed. Next slide, please. I used the cross-K function to evaluate spatial dependence between shootings and other locations. So this approach involves comparing the observed distribution of shootings throughout the city with similar simulated distributions that represent spatial independence. So the observed and expected cross-K values are graphed to illustrate attraction or repulsion between the two locations over a range of distances. In the subsequent slides, I'll have results with graphs of the cross-L function, which is a square root transformation of cross-K that's easier to interpret visually, especially at short distances. Next slide. So the graphs show the cross-L function up to a distance of 1,000 feet, and the pointwise confidence envelope is shown in gray around the line of independence. So distances at which the observed cross-L value deviates above the envelope are indications of attraction, whereas departures below the envelope indicate significant repulsion between the locations and shootings. So there's significant attraction between bus stops and shootings for all distances greater than 75 feet. In other words, at distances of 75 feet or more away from bus stops, there are more shootings than would be expected if the two locations were spatially unrelated. For green light locations, there's significant attraction for all distances. And within 200 feet of green light locations, there were 5.5 times as many shootings as would be expected under independence. Next slide, please. Grocery stores, significant attraction is restricted to distances of 325 feet or more, and below that, it's still within the confidence envelope of independence. And no significant attraction or repulsion was observed at any distance for schools up to 1,000 feet. So 75% of Detroit schools were located at least 725 feet away from the nearest shooting. Next slide, please. With vacant properties, the short range attraction is limited to just blighted vacant properties, as properties that were registered as vacant but not blighted only exhibit attraction at the longer range distances. Next slide. And alcohol outlets, similar to green light locations, there's significant attraction between alcohol outlets and shootings for all distances. There were 4 times as many shootings within 200 feet of alcohol outlets as would be expected if the locations were independent. And this was consistent across the different types of alcohol outlets. Next slide, please. So for the most part, the spatial dependence between places and shootings persisted regardless of the time of day. One of the interesting time variant components comes from on-premises alcohol outlets. So the graph on the left is the relationship during the day, and on the right is during the night. So there is spatial independence during the day between these locations and shootings, but significant attraction at night. Next slide, please. So before I conclude, I do want to address a few limitations. The main one being that the shooting data come from a single year and a year in which COVID-19 significantly impacted everyday life. While the pandemic could be expected to influence the distribution of firearm violence, given the changes in routine activities and adverse health and social outcomes generally, a recent study found that the concentration of shooting hotspots in similar cities remained stable in 2020. Second limitation, 37% of the shootings were geocoded to the intersection level. However, the overall attraction did not change in the sensitivity analyses that I conducted, which excluded shootings that were just coded to intersections. And finally, with measurement, network distance more accurately captures movement distances within a city. However, at very short distances, such as 200 feet of a location, the differences should be minimal. Next slide, please. So the findings from Detroit are largely consistent with what is known or hypothesized about attractors of firearm violence, specifically in environmental criminology theories and reflected in crime prevention through environmental design strategies. Two of the notable findings, as I mentioned, only vacant properties that were cited for blight and not those simply registered as being vacant significantly attracted shootings at short distances, and alcohol outlets, which are consistently identified as attractors of crime, likewise exhibited significant attraction at very short distances. An encouraging result, again, was that for all distances up to 1,000 feet, the locations of shootings in schools remained independent. The attraction between shootings in schools was independent. As I've already mentioned, on-premises alcohol outlets were shooting attractors only during the night. So this suggests that future research and interventions seeking to prevent firearm injury near these locations should consider how the risk may vary during the day. And finally, implications for future research. Cross-K is a beneficial first step for identifying locations that are shooting attractors, as well as locations that may be appropriate candidates for place-based interventions. Beyond this type of bivariate analysis, case control studies and analyses that examine multiple risk factors such as population density and specific characteristics of the places of interest would be informative. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Semenza and I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University at Camden. And today I'm going to be talking about how firearm dealers are spatially related to gun violence. And I have to give a very unexpected thank you to Stephen for laying a lot of the groundwork with his paper, because I'm actually going to be building off of some of the very concepts that he's already just discussed in the last minutes. So thank you very much for that. And of course, I have to give shout out to some of my colleagues at Rutgers University in Newark, Beth Griffiths, as well as my own department, Richard Stansfield, and Jia Zhu, who is at St. John's University. Next slide, please. So the foundations of the study are built off of some recent research that is looking at the relationship between firearm dealer location and different rates of homicide or gun violence. And a bunch of recent studies, including some of my own research in the last couple of years, has noted that at different levels of the social ecology, there is a relationship between the density of firearm dealers or the number of firearm dealers in a given space, whether that's at the county or the city level, and rates of different types of homicides, so intimate partner homicide in particular, incidents of robbery, and then there's been research to show that all-cause homicide is also correspondent to the density of firearm dealers. But most of this research has been done at a relatively high or kind of macro level of the social ecology. And so the question that Beth Corpus and I were kind of tossing around when we were working on a grant and starting to think about seriously, well, this has never been looked at the individual kind of street or spatial point level. What might be going on here when we really zoom down and try and look at the spatial relationship between the firearm dealers in a given space and shootings that are occurring around that dealer. And so we are kind of thinking through two approaches, an opportunity versus an availability theory. And this is under revision after a review for a journal. So I'm really eliciting feedback right now if anybody has suggestions or ways of thinking about this. Because on the one hand, gun stores may attract violence in similar ways to liquor stores, bars, payday lenders, creating more opportunities for violence to occur. But on the other hand, the gun stores are very unique compared to the liquor stores, grocery stores, schools, in that they provide greater availability of firearms. And so potentially what might be happening is that you have heightened availability in kind of proximate spaces because of the dealer itself. And so that's kind of what we have been playing around with. And then most important is thinking about how disadvantage in different neighborhoods might compound the problem. And so one of the things that led us to kind of go further with this analysis is thinking, well, if we break up different types of neighborhoods where there are gun stores located, and you look at that differentially by disadvantage, how might that actually have an influence on whether or not there is a spatial relationship between gun dealers and between the occurrence of non-fatal and fatal shootings in those areas? Next slide, please. So the data and methods, I won't go too deep into the talking about the spatial analysis because again, Stephen has done some of that legwork for me. But we focused on this analysis specifically in the city of Atlanta. We got data on all shooting incidents from the APD 2016 to 2018. So we have 3 years of shooting data. And we used that in conjunction with the main independent variable, which are firearm dealer locations in the city of Atlanta. And we got this through a public database and a resource through the ATF. So that was really useful in helping us map those two things. And then our main kind of moderating variable that allows us to look at these things differently is neighborhood disadvantage. And so we pulled together a factor from the American Community Survey that combined percent of the neighborhoods living in poverty with female-headed household, percent unemployed, and percent public assistance. And so, this is a relatively straightforward way of looking at kind of an overall relationship between shooting incidents and firearm dealers, and then we break out by the average below or above of neighborhood disadvantage per neighborhood. And the method, similar to what Stephen was talking about, is the cross-K function, but we are using a street network analysis. And what I really love about this, and I've learned a lot in this process with Gia and Beth, is that it's a much more realistic measurement of thinking about how people travel via street networks rather than a grid, so to speak. And so what we can look at is using this method, whether or not compared to a random distribution of shootings are attractive, repellent, or completely randomly spatially associated with the location of firearm dealers. And so we mapped out the coordinates with ArcGIS and then looked at the K-cross via SANet. Next slide, please. And so here are the initial results. So you have your spatial distribution of dealers and shootings in Atlanta on the left-hand side for the 3 years. The firearm dealers in disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged neighborhoods broken out by the color of their little dot. And then on the right-hand side, you have the cross-K function for all neighborhoods. So we haven't split it up yet by disadvantaged and less disadvantaged neighborhoods. And what you can see is, for the most part, firearm dealers do not have any major significant relationship spatially with the shooting incidents that are occurring around them. You get actually a little bit of a repellent effect when you get towards larger distances over on the right-hand side. But overall, it's within those confident intervals of kind of random distribution. And so we can't really say that there's much there. Next slide, please. It's when you start to break up the neighborhood that you really see a difference. And on the left-hand side, what you see is that when we're talking about firearm dealers, there is this attractive effect that compared to random spatial distribution, shootings are more likely to take place around these dealer locations that are in disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? So this kind of corroborates some of that moderation expectation that we had initially. And then really interestingly, on the right-hand side, you have the non-disadvantaged neighborhoods in Atlanta, and there's essentially a repellent effect, or it's more likely than random that these shootings will take place further away from these dealers. Next slide, please. And so the key takeaways here are that in general, the shootings are not spatially dependent on firearm dealers. But when we look at different types of neighborhoods, looking by disadvantage in those places, there is a relationship in that dealers in more disadvantaged neighborhoods seem to attract shootings. The question I still am kind of working through is whether or not we think this is an opportunity versus an availability issue, and I'd love to hear questions about that. But from our perspective, as we're thinking through this, certainly thinking about the implications for supply side interventions, especially in disadvantaged spaces, thinking through, bolstering gun shop security, reducing CAS reliance, and then in more rare instances, likely targeting corrupt dealers, straw purchasing in those proximate areas, et cetera. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Jay. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University in the School of Public Health, and I'm excited to talk to you about this work. I'm always excited to be back with the FACS Consortium, where I was a member of the inaugural postdoctoral fellow class, which was really a pivotal opportunity for me in going into firearm injury research. Next slide. This work was funded by the Harvard Kennedy School of Government through a gift from Bloomberg Philanthropies. So want to acknowledge collaborators at HKS, at Boston University, at University of Michigan, Maryland, and Dr. Jason Goldstick at Michigan, who's a member of the FACS Consortium. Next slide. So the place-based risk that I'm thinking about here is abandoned buildings, and especially abandoned housing. When I was a postdoc with the FACS Consortium, I led a study looking at abandoned building demolitions in Detroit. And we found that neighborhoods that got more demolitions as part of a large-scale program saw larger reductions in gun violence than neighborhoods that got fewer demolitions. And many of you will know that this fits into a larger body of evidence on how improving the condition of physical spaces, particularly vacant properties, can reduce nearby firearm violence. And so this is work that Lainey and Mark have done, Charlie Brannis and Gina South and colleagues from Philadelphia, particularly finding that improving the condition of vacant lots can make nearby spaces safer. And a recent analysis from Philadelphia found that those effects varied depending on where the vacant lot was located. So the effects were smaller when a vacant lot, which was turned into a simple small green space. The effects were smaller when those vacant lots were close to transit stations and liquor stores. And they seemed to be bigger when the vacant lots were close to business districts And so the authors there thought that one plausible explanation is that in places that are more subject to community control, then this vacant lot intervention is more effective because residents, business owners, and others are better able to maintain control over those spaces. So the new green space becomes a safe and stays clean and stays safe after greening. Next slide, please. So in this study, we wanted to take forward this question about demolitions. Our previous work had found that demolishing abandoned buildings made the surrounding area safer, but we weren't able to answer sort of that first question that we started getting from city partners, which was, okay, if we've got 5 or 10 demolitions that we're planning to do, or we have a budget for, where should we do those demolitions? Are the effects likely to differ whether we do it in place A or place B? Next slide. So in this study, we're looking at Rochester, New York, and I'll get more deeper into the data that we have. But just to show you sort of the spatial distribution, demolitions, our intervention, are mapped on the left, and fatal and non-fatal shootings are mapped on the right. By way of historical context, on the next slide, we see a redlining map from the 1930s. This was US government policy that supported mortgage discrimination and other forms of housing discrimination, largely on the basis of race. So structural racism and discrimination, as we can see on these maps, are closely associated with both shootings and the abandoned buildings that call for demolition. Next slide. So in this study, we divided up Rochester into a grid with small squares, 500 by 500 feet each. And we looked only at squares that got at least one demolition through the whole intervention period. So we're only comparing effects based on the timing and the number of demolitions. We had 21 years of fatal and non-fatal shootings, which we're analyzing at the level of those individual grid squares. And the exposure or the intervention, the treatment here, was the number of demolitions between 2009, so about halfway through those years of shootings data that we had, and 2019. And we wanted to think about demolitions treatment here in 2 different ways. The first is in terms of sort of short to medium term effects. So that is the demolition this year, effects on shootings next year. And then we also wanted to think cumulatively about what happens as more demolitions change the neighborhood landscape over time. So we analyze those in separate ways, in separate models. We also controlled for population, poverty, and housing vacancy as time varying covariates at the grid square level. And we used 2-way fixed effects, sort of a standard econometric model for analyzing treatment effects. Next slide, please. So then here's the part where we wanted to look at those moderators, those nearby environmental factors that might influence treatment effects. And because our demolitions data started in 2009, we wanted data about the built environment that goes back to pre-intervention. And so for those of you who are spatial analysts, you might be thinking about what kind of data could I get from 2009 to look at the built environment in Rochester, New York, sort of small to mid-sized city. There are a few options, but what we wanted to use, what we ended up using here was aerial imagery, high resolution ortho imagery that's collected by the state. And then we pass it through first pre-trained convolutional neural networks. This is a deep learning approach that pulled out these kind of raw features of the images. Then we pass that through a standard k-means cluster algorithm, an unsupervised way of, if none of that means anything to you, we identified 5 different classes of the built environment that are sort of where within each class they're similar. On the top, we see the highest density, most connected areas. And on the bottom in cluster E, we see undeveloped sort of open spaces. Next slide, please. And you can see the distribution across the city of these different clusters. Next slide, please. So very quickly, we saw the expected effects of demolitions on shootings, just as in the previous study. But most importantly, what we found was that in the highest density cluster, the areas with the highest residential density, street density, most buildings, most connectivity, there is an effect in the following year from a demolition, but we don't see that cumulative effect. By contrast, lower density clusters showed the opposite result. Next slide. So the most important finding here is sort of what we think might explain this. And here, what we think explains this best is the idea that foot traffic in high density areas could make it harder to maintain community control at a newly demolished site. That's when we may be moving from the removal of the abandoned building to the creation of a vacant lot that's becoming unkempt over time. So in the next slide, our conclusion from this work is that cities that are using demolitions or thinking about demolitions in connection to public safety should really prioritize vacant lot maintenance at demolition sites that are in high traffic areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I think I'm back. I'm back. Thank you. Those were really terrific presentations. I assume I'm being heard. Now I just wanted to open up for some questions, and we did get some questions in the Q&A. And if you have any more, most certainly please please do put them in the chat. And yes, thank you for all the presenters just turning your videos on. I was just about to ask you to do that. The first question is for Daniel is somebody asked about ghost guns and what are the implications for your findings with these ghost guns that are internet purchases? How might that change or influence either the conclusions you might draw or might have influenced some of the results that you found?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We focus here specifically on all type 1, 2, and big box dealers that are in the Atlanta neighborhoods. So we're really only able to make any kind of statements around the physical location of where these guns can get purchased. Whether or not the absence of a store might influence somebody who can't get access to the guns to be more likely to go online to try and obtain a ghost gun. Can't say for sure. I think that's an important area of inquiry, but for at least in terms of the actual acquisition of guns, when we say that there's a spatial relationship between the dealers and incidents that are happening around them, I don't think it's just that people are going and buying a gun legally, everything above board. I think that what it's doing potentially is having an influence on straw purchases, people going and buying a gun in nearby places on behalf of people who are not able to get guns. Being more of a target for stores that might get robbed, bleeding guns from the primary market into the secondary market in kind of proximate spaces. So I think that for sure there's a relationship between legitimate spaces to buy firearm and these underground markets, but the ghost gun's really hard thing to quantify when it comes to these locations.
Great, thank you. Lauren, next question, I actually have two of them. One I'm curious about, so I want to make sure I get it in since I'm going to use the prerogative of having missed the beginning. I didn't miss it, actually, I was here. I just didn't miss the introductions. But secondly, there's another question that came in. So why don't I ask one question? After you do that, I'm going to come right back at you. But it was this issue of the non-fatal injuries. Basically, what do you think we could do about addressing these? Like the best strategies, I guess, for addressing some of these non-fatal injuries. And after you take a minute for that, I'll come back with the other one. Not to leave anybody else out, but as long as I had your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pediatric non-fatal shootings, I think there's kind of two approaches to preventing those. One being lowering firearm violence as a whole within the communities. We saw an increase, but we also saw an increase in all of firearm violence. So we need to prevent firearm violence through community-based interventions, demolishing abandoned buildings, improving the collective efficacy, lowering physical disorder within these communities. But we also have to take a more trauma-informed approach to people that have been victims or been exposed to this violence from the clinical system. So within our pediatric hospital here, they treat the patients, but they don't have money post-discharge behavioral health services as people leave the system. So we need to prevent firearm violence in the communities, but also have more trauma-informed approaches as victims and families are leaving the clinical systems.
Great, thanks. The question from one of the participants was basically, it was interesting. I actually thought it struck me as well that the 11 to 15-year-olds were involved in a lot of robbery shootings. It seems like a relatively young age to be involved in robbery shootings. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts about why that finding. That would seem to be the most surprising finding to me of that table, actually.
Yes. So the 11 to 15-year-olds, robberies, that's kind of when many young kids are indoctrinated kind of into getting introduced to guns as being carried for protection within these communities. From reading the narratives, as well as some other qualitative interviews I've done on another project, they are purchasing guns, they're purchasing cell phones, shoes, other clothing items via Instagram meetups. They've met on Instagram, they're meeting in person, and then that deal has gone bad, which turns into a criminal robbery from that perspective. So I think it's the younger age group we're seeing is moving into carrying weapons for their protection, and having guns leads to shootings, as we know from decades of research.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And being an old guy, I'm hip to somewhat social media, but that role that plays actually opens up a whole interesting door of analysis.
Yeah, and even beyond robberies, that's what I've heard is a lot of arguments or disagreements have started on Instagram or other social media platforms and then resulted in a shooting at some point in the future.
We had a colleague who did some work on Twitter and looking at Twitter data and seeing how that kind of related to more likelihood of gang shootings. My next question, thank you. My next question is for Stephen. One of the surprising findings that you presented was the green light, the idea that green light crime reduction initiative was actually associated with some shootings. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on that or help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's kind of a self-selection issue. These are businesses and locations that are likely pre-existing, or they've had incidents, shootings, other crimes happening for a while, and this is kind of we're going to join this crime reduction partnership in the city to see if we can address this issue and deter crime here. So it's likely places that they're joining the program for a reason, and in the early evaluation of the program so far is that it hasn't had much of an effect on violent crime. And so that would be kind of consistent with what you're seeing here is that there's still firearm attractors even after becoming green light locations.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of like some of the work that we're finding is that some of this work is happening in the highest crime areas. And while they have the most room to move, they are certainly not themselves the drivers of that. They're just one of a larger complex. So yeah, that makes sense. That, helps me think about it and know that at least some of my interpretations of our work isn't completely just in my head. So I appreciate that thought. Makes a lot of sense. John, we have a few more minutes. I'm going to ask you the last question of the day. And you touched upon this a little bit where you talked about, and I was prepping my thought like, oh, what about, and what we found is once the demolition occurs, now there's an empty lot. And you sort of pointed out like, wait a minute, you guys, we shouldn't just demolish those lands because we know that an empty, uncared for lot is also an attraction for crime. So I was just wondering if you just really push your thinking here. What would you recommend if I was a city person developing, I just got some federal funds to demolish a bunch of old buildings. And now you're telling me I should also do something with the empty lots that result. What should I do? How should I spend some of that money to address that issue? And should I focus on, oh, I just lost John. Did I just lose John? Oh, his Wi-Fi just froze. It's one of those days. I'll just pose it to any of the three of you since he's gone. Sorry about that. But do you have any thoughts about that? Like, what should we do? How should we do that? Should we save some of the money to deal with the empty lot? What are some ideas or strategies? Anybody in the last couple of minutes? Any thoughts? Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, so just based off of John's work and a lot of the other work that's been done around greening, to me, there would be a real need to not just stop at the demolition, right? That you can't remove the problem and then expect that things are going to improve if you just leave the empty lot. And so if you're thinking of from a budgetary standpoint, you have to work it out where maybe you look at, okay, where are the most shootings clustering around particular demolition, targeting those, and then you're marking a certain component of that budget to then green those spaces, right? So that you're really seeing the project fully through and not just kind of going halfway and then creating opportunity for risk. So I'll stop there because I see that John's back, but that's just my initial thought.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. John, I don't know if you heard the whole question and we're at time, but the question was, what would you do? And you maybe heard the first part. What would you suggest for demolition and greening of the the vacant lot that results? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sorry for cutting out.
No worries.
The greening is critical, right? I mean, we know that when you conduct a demolition, you might remove a really bad hazard in the abandoned building, but you get this empty lot, which is prone to going into disrepair. And so I think all the evidence from your work and others would indicate that the more investment that you put in upfront, the better, but also you need to put structures in place, including community engaged structures to make sure that maintenance continues.
Right. Thank you, John. Sorry about that cutout. And sorry about my drop of the internet. There's something in the winds these days, but I want to thank everybody. Those were really interesting presentations and really interesting analyses as well. So thank you all for that. We have a 10-minute break, everybody. We have the next session coming up. There's a choice of two sessions, one on the primary and secondary prevention of risk assessment, intervention, evaluation, and another one on the epidemiology, COVID, and the sequelae related to firearms. So we'll be back at 2:05. Take a little break and hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everybody.